Welcome to this talk. For anyone who's watching this online later, this is the last talk of the night on the slowest day of the event. So it's not exactly a huge crowd, which is totally fine. I also didn't exactly make it clear what exactly I was going to talk about here. So you all are coming in blind with no particular clue of what I might be talking about, which is fine. Typically, I would have a lot different presentation method, but this particular topic had some intriguing aspects to it. Namely, as I kept interviewing people, I became less and less sure about what exactly I was going to be talking about. I started interviewing subject matter experts over a month ago, and the talk just kept changing. So what is on the printed materials is something like AI and Tool-Assisted Speedruns. And at the end of the day, I decided to call this Speedrun Doping, Unshaming Tool-Assisted Speedruns. So I'm going to unpack that because there's a lot that is in that sentence. And yes, I am very thin on slides. I have done everything from the simplest possible setup where it's just a normal presentation software, whatever, whether that's a PowerPoint or LibreOffice equivalent or Google Docs, all the way up to really ornate things where I'm presenting inside of OBS, and I have all these crazy graphics and videos, and I'm talking on a treadmill. I've done everything. But I don't think I have ever given a talk from Vim as my slide method. And the reason I'm here is because the more I talked about this with different subject matter experts, and the more I kind of dove into the context of, well, what is a tool-assisted speedrun or a superplay? What is the impact of artificial intelligence? What even is tooling in the context of speedruns? The topic just kept getting larger. And I couldn't even figure out how best to confine it into slides, or what I would even say if I did. So at the end of the day, I just decided to have a roundtable discussion. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to have a roundtable. 4DD, there we go. So what constitutes cheating in speedruns? Why? And what are the consequences? So we're going to have an interesting roundtable conversation. Since it'll be inconvenient for the people in the room, which there's now actually fairly more people here than I was expecting. Since you're not necessarily near a mic, I'll just repeat whatever questions come up, and we'll work with it for that purpose for video later. So this is, for all intents and purposes, a roundtable discussion with people in the room. Congrats, you're part of the talk. So let me unpack my title. My actual title of this talk is Speedrun Doping, Unshaming Tool-Assisted Speedruns. So let me explain what I mean by that. All right, first of all, what's a speedrun? Well, speedrun is trying to complete a video game as fast as possible. There's a lot of other possible definitions you can go with, but that's the tried and true example. And one of the websites that was very predominant in the speedrunning space was Speed Demos Archive, SDA. Speed Demos Archive has been around for a long time. It shows. Their website has also been around for a long time and has looked pretty much the same for the entirety of it, as far as I can tell. And they have some interesting and potentially antiquated ideas of what a speedrun should be. For instance, if you look at what they allow in speedrun categories on Speed Demos Archive, you'll find that it's extremely restrictive. If you look at the fine print in their rules, you cannot map fire to the mouse wheel and present that as submit that as a run to Speed Demos Archive. They consider that cheating. And they go out of their way to argue over these points in wondrous detail if you go back a decade or more. They will only allow it if inside of the game itself you can, in its own key bindings, bind mouse wheel up and down to something. And then they will consider it kosher. But in every other respect, if you have a mouse like this one right here, the Simex Anywhere 2 mouse, where you can bind a key to the mouse wheel, even better if it's one of these free rolling ones, you can even hear it. They don't like that. They consider that cheating. And that's just the tip of the cheating berg. So there's a whole cadre, a whole long list of thou shalt nots in their rules. And it's actually for a good reason, because they want everyone to be able to play on a level playing field. When you're doing speedruns, you want the category to be the same, and you want everyone to have the same general advantage. There are some things that are outside of SDA's control, and for that matter, any leaderboard, whether it's SRC, speedrun.com, Speed Demos, Speedruns Live, SRL, SDA themselves, or a number of other sites out there that have speedruns, you're always going to have some, oh, okay, well, it's a little bit different here. No, oh, okay, well, we have to make a corner case here. And a lot of it is non-deterministic situations where maybe one person's system is going to boot the game faster or whatnot. So they started taking that out of the equation. They start timing from when you press start on the game. And each game has a little bit of different characteristics of what is the start time. And they have different rules for certain games for when is the game done. And there are some extreme categories where you have to watch the whole credits in some cases because there is a button press at the very end of the credits in order to reach the end. So there's all of these different definitions about what start and stop times are. And a lot of those are kind of centered around, well, how do we make things a little bit more deterministic and consistent in timing? Which makes a lot of sense until you run into games that are wildly different depending on whether the person running it has an SSD or a rusty spinning metal old hard drive. So you're never going to get perfection in this, but they certainly try. So, of course, having a consistent set of rules where you don't even allow someone to remap to a mouse wheel is all in the name of consistency. You want everyone playing on a level playfield. And we have a really great example of this in real life gaming. And it's called the Olympics and their anti-doping rules, right? If you go to the Olympics, they are going to go out of their way to ensure that no one is cheating under any circumstances. That means regular drug testing and checking for a new list of drugs every time there's a new Olympics coming around. And they enforce it. They have kicked a number of different athletes out for various different things. So, all right, you have a real-world example of wanting to keep a sport pure, whether that's a physical sport or speedrun. All right. What happens when you start expanding branches or different tools, tools of all kinds? What is a tool? What can you get away with adding before SDA starts throwing you out, or speedrun.com starts throwing you out, or even SRL, the folks on Twitch that do Speedruns Live? At what point have you crossed the threshold where you're cheating just a little too much and they won't accept what you're doing? All right. Tool-assisted speedruns are definitely cheating if you don't tell people you did it. The problem we've run into in the past is some people will make a run in an emulator with tools like slow motion, tools like frame advance, where you stop and pause the game entirely, and what you're actually recording is super slow motion. You're literally frame advancing through the game, or any number of other things. So you have all of the benefits of tools. You can remove human luck, memory. You can take away reflexes. You can take all of that off the table with a tool-assisted speedrun. In fact, that's why people watch them. You're no longer watching the limits of what a human can do. You're watching the limits of what the hardware and the game programming can do. Different category. If you present a tool-assisted speedrun as human effort, you're going to have really upset folks. So there's really great reasons to have rules that say, well, we can't have these tools in our runs and polluting them. But what I'm here to talk to you about today is how do we accept some other areas that involve tools, still be harmonious, still be fair to everyone, and do it in a way that specifically unshames certain types of tools, in particular for those who are differently abled. Now, there's a lot of different ways to phrase this. I've asked a few subject matter experts, what's the right phrasing that you would prefer? What wording would you like? I spoke with someone just this week. I interviewed a speedrunner who happens to have been blind from birth. I asked him, what phrasing do you like? And he said, well, differently abled is fine. I talked to someone who had muscular challenges where they had body asymmetry. They had less control with one hand versus the other, one side of the body versus the other. And they disagreed that differently abled was the correct term. So I do apologize. I'm still trying to figure out what the correct, I don't want to say pronouns, but verbiage is for how to describe this. But we're talking about a situation where there is a speedrunner, a gamer, trying to play a game, trying to compete, who has some adaptation they must use in order to participate. For instance, the speedrunner who is blind, they're not going to be able to run the same category that someone who is fully abled can do. It's just not going to happen. They need tools. But they will never be on SDA, at least not with the current rules. So how do we find a way to allow tools to coexist with non-tool oriented runs or branches or categories, whatever phrasing you want to use, and still allow this other community to participate? So I'm going to wax poetic a little bit here for a second, not that I haven't already. I want people of all abilities to be able to compete. And what they need is going to drastically change depending on what their individual capabilities are and what adaptations are required. Way back when Tool-Assisted Speedruns started and a website that was originally called NES Videos, well, it didn't start there, but certainly when things started to expand there were some problems because a lot of the encodes, a lot of the videos being passed around were being passed around before YouTube even existed. A lot of times these were raw videos with no context, no description, nothing in them that described what they were. The most famous one being a video that was released by someone named Morimoto. This is an unusual individual in 2003 that did a speed attack of Super Mario Bros. With two S's, 3, without any context whatsoever. And it created mass confusion because a lot of people watched this run with Mario getting ridiculously close to a piranha plant and near misses and getting 99 lives and all kinds of crazy stuff happening with no context, just no context. Now, if you knew the video game well enough, you could tell that there was something off. This was done with an emulator called Fantasia that even in the day was not exactly known as the most accurate. And there were some obvious signs that something was amiss. But because there wasn't any labeling in English that described what was going on, and the only address went to a website entirely in Japanese, there was very little understanding of what people were looking at. So, a video showing a speedrun that had been made with tools was distributed that upset people greatly. Why? Because doping had happened. In the same way that if someone were to walk into the Olympics and do things that totally violate doping standards, whether that's steroids or something else, didn't admit to it, didn't acknowledge it, got a gold medal, and then tried to pawn it off, that's basically the reaction that the SDA community had, for good reason. Suddenly, their pure categories and their pure categorization of what was allowed was getting crapped on, for lack of a better term. There was this video that was out on the internet that showed people playing so much better than them, and it made them look bad. And so they got really upset, for good reason, right? So the very first thing that NES Videos, BizQuit, who started it, did is implemented labeling. Labeling is a complicated word when you start talking about some of the other topics I've already discussed about, say, differently abled gaming. But nevertheless, labeling was really important. When you made a video encode, you had to make sure that you said, this is a tool-assisted speedrun. And that ethos still holds true with TAS videos today. For those that might not know, I am DwangoAC. I am keeper of TASBot, but my primary role on TAS videos is as a senior ambassador. I'm part of the senior staff of TAS videos these days. And I see from a very different perspective now what level of effort we've put in over the years as a website to ensure that everything we put out has labeling on it, even going so far as to hunt down people that have taken the recordings and just thrown them back up on their websites or different YouTube encodes with no context. It's very important to us being the TAS Videos staff, to ensure that there is proper labeling so that people understand this is effectively a doped run. This was a run that was done with help, a lot of help, like kind of the ultimate form of help. Okay, so we have the history of Speed Demos Archive not allowing any adulteration happening. We have Tool-Assisted Speedruns, now on TAS Videos in particular, that are 100% doping. All of the tools are at the disposal of the author, and the videos are properly labeled. But then we run into this really funny gray area. You see, something happened at TAS Videos over the years. It started out as NES videos primarily with specifically Mario runs, and then specifically Nintendo runs, and then when it expanded beyond just the Nintendo Entertainment System, it went from NES videos to TAS videos and expanded to Genesis and Super Nintendo and various other, at the time, rather inaccurate emulators, but nevertheless expanding to new video game consoles, all the way up to Nintendo 64 and other consoles in time. And something funny happened over time. We went from Tool-Assisted Superplays. If you go to TAS Videos, the TAS in TAS Videos is not Tool-Assisted Speedruns, it's Tool-Assisted Superplays. We went from, hey, we had a human playing in slow motion. We had a human using tools to assist their gameplay, and they played the game all in one session, but with slow motion that helped them play better. So they did a super play of the game. They did something that looked amazing. A normal run-through would not look like this. You got too lucky or things like that. We went from tool-assisted super plays to a very, very specific definition that was at the exact opposite end of what SDA was. If Speed Demos Archive was no tools whatsoever, what TAS Videos became in the years that followed was only completely frame-perfect content is allowed here. This means content that was made with an emulator of a run where the specific goal was to beat the game as fast as possible. And if it's not frame perfect, it will get rejected and declined, right? It had to be completely perfect. And what was left in the middle, completely unaddressed by any of these sites, was what the differently abled community needed. They needed the ability to play with tools, in other words, play with another category, play with a different branch. But neither SDA nor TAS Videos would accept them. And as the years went on, speedrun.com came out, and it got a little better, kind of, but then it ended up in some very awkward situations. One of the things I discovered in researching this talk is that Last of Us 2 was released with specific modes for people with vision impairment. In other words, the theory is that you could play that game while completely blind. Now, it's very linear, and many things are watered down, but it is theoretically possible to play that game with just a pair of headphones through a series of auditory hints and other things. Now, I haven't personally played it myself that way, but I did talk to a person who has gone through it, and it's pretty interesting listening to what they did. The developer went to the extra effort of adding this mode in, but it led to some interesting debate in especially speedrun.com. Can fully sighted humans play in that mode, and is doing so disrespectful to them? And they've been arguing back and forth, and it seems like the general consensus was that they didn't want to allow fully sighted people to play that mode that was specifically designed for people with visual impairments. Which also meant that people with visual impairments didn't have that category either. So it's leading to some interesting discussions that I think need to be had. And frankly, the talk that I'm giving here is based on seeing a complete lack of this discussion. There are people discussing elements of this, but I want to talk right here today about how we solve this. And I'm not coming here with all the answers, because as I kept interviewing more people, I kept coming up with more answers, or more questions than answers. And one of the things that made me bring AI into the conversation is, okay, if someone is differently abled, What does that mean? It means that they're not maybe fully sighted or have full hearing, or maybe they don't have full mobility. What tools might they use to help them play and experience the game? What is their goal? Is their goal to speedrun it, or is their goal just to experience it? One of the things that we've looked into just in the last week out of these discussions, actually, is, if you guys know from last year, we did something called Triforce% by Soren and Save State in particular, but a team of over 24 folks contributed. We played with TASBot and Save State through Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, and built on a lot of fan theories and added our own story that took beta elements from Ocarina of Time that we knew about and other things from Nintendo properties and hints, and combined it together into a wonderful story. And we presented it on stage over the course of an hour at Summer Games Done Quick last year. If you haven't seen that yet, definitely watch it. We call it Triforce% now, but it was released as Summer Games Done Quick 2022 Ocarina of Time Beta Showcase, was the way we phrased it. Very worth watching. We presented a story. We had dialogue writers. We had voice actresses and actors. We had 3D modelers and level editors, and all kinds of effort went into this. We basically made a movie inside of Ocarina of Time's engine and did other horrible things to it. Just watch it. You'll see what I mean. So we have a movie now, and I got called on for never having made a version where someone who was blind could experience the full story. We never thought about that. I never considered it. So as a developer in this situation, I acted as the executive producer, or the producer of this project. As the producer, it never even crossed my mind to create a version of this story in a way that was accessible to the visually impaired community. It just never even occurred to me beforehand. We're fixing that. We've worked out a person who's volunteered to do basically the equivalent of a movie that has a descriptive audio track. So we're doing that where the dialogue will all be read out and things like that. But it just never occurred to me in the first place. And it doesn't occur to most studios, and the ones that it does occur to, it's too expensive, right? There's a lot of things that you don't want to do. So what I'd like to talk about today, now that I've spent all of that time with exposition and all of that roundabout, what I'd like to talk about is, how do we create a different culture that allows for these types of speedruns to happen? How do we, first of all, create a site or niches on a site to allow this to happen? How do we define what adaptations, what tools were used, what branches there were? And how do we allow this to be accepted? I have a funny feeling that if someone from SDA is listening to this talk, it might sound like I'm dunking on them. That's not actually the case. I actually have a great deal of respect for their very exacting quality standards. They want very clearly to have everyone who's competing be on the same level and be able to say, this record is comparable to this record, and yes, it edged out by X seconds, and therefore this person is in first place. But we did it after carefully judging and reviewing everything. I don't want to take that away from them. My goal with this talk is to discuss amongst the room, have you ever met anyone who might potentially like to speedrun a game, or would like to play through a game even casually with adaptations? Have you ever met anyone like that, and have they conveyed anything about that? Now, the chances of someone in this room just magically having had that happen is kind of low, but I'll leave it open. Has anyone ever had that happen?
For me?
Yeah.
So I'm actually colorblind, so it's not as big as if, say, I was like partially blind or like anything more serious than that. But I have had cases in games where they use colors as cues for things, and it actually makes it difficult. Like, for example, actually there was a game that I was playing at the indie, like one of the indie games upstairs, and they actually had a red health bar underneath the gold like stamina bar. I didn't even know that bar was there, so I was very confused as to like if I look closer and I know it's there, I can see it, but it's, for me, like red is a lot darker than the average person, so that was something that's a common theme for me. Like games that in the past would not have necessarily have that, and nowadays they're starting to have that go on.
So just to repeat this over the mic so that it can be heard for the recording, I'll let you choose to share your name if you like, but an audience member happens to be colorblind and has experienced challenges in video games that are not well suited for that. Specific example was a red health bar that was a tent that was literally invisible to them. And
Not quite invisible, but it's
very, very hard.
to see. I
Yeah.
wouldn't have known it was there.
So very hard to see.
All about it.
So, in the context of making gaming more accessible, there's 508 compliance and all kinds of other conversations we could get into, but from my perspective, from my viewpoint of the world, I'm coming from the TASVideos view of, okay, we have the ability to take this game and put it in an emulator. What might we be able to do? One of the things that I would love is for more games to have Lua scripting, especially older games, retro games. For instance, one way to solve this problem, the developer has long walked away from this game. They are not going to invest resources to make this better. What if we added in Lua scripting to take that health bar that is currently not visible because it's the wrong shade of red, and we augmented it with a screen overlay? What if that, by doing that, it changes the timing of the game? Should that now be rejected from consideration? Obviously, you're now playing on an emulator. It now can't be done on SDA because they require real consoles. They don't like emulators. They really dislike emulators. A lot of websites will reject that. So if we add a tool that allows someone to gain access to speedrunning that game, how do we not shame them for needing that access? So I'm gonna open that up for a little more discussion here, and I'll make sure I get back to your point in a second. How do you think we should handle that? Do you think that we should adjust rules on sites like speedrun.com and convince them that yes, you should allow on emulator for this class of play? Do you think that we should do that, or do you think that we should do something different? What do you think?
So I think that it's fine if I'm just category. So just like how there's like women's sport records in printing, for example, and also men's sport records. We have, console records versus EAS records versus the generic emulator records. So,
So audience thought was just put it on a different category, which unfortunately I don't know how. One thing about speedrun.com is that I'm not as familiar with it, and it's not because it's a competitor. It's not really a competitor to TASVideos. I just haven't actually spent a lot of time diving into speedrun.com. But I am aware that each game can have its own peculiarities and different rules, and I think it's going to come down to each individual game. It's not going to be a site thing right now. I would love to see that with broader acceptance, to be honest. But I don't even know if we could break through with that first step of, okay, we have a classic retro game. It normally would be played on a real console, but in this case, it must be played on an emulator so we can use this scripting to overlay this visibility adaptation. Okay, let's at least accept that first. Now, I will say one quick caveat. I'm not out to break the law. I'm very cautious with everything I do with TASBot to make sure I'm buying an original cartridge. And in most cases, I'm not even touching DMCA because I have a cartridge that doesn't have any encryption on it. And I'm using my own cartridge, which I have put in usually an Infinite NES Lives board, read the contents of, and I'm now working from my legally owned backup. So this doesn't have to be illegal. Just using an emulator is not a sure sign that you've pirated anything. So I want to remove that shaming and stigma as well. But even talking about emulators as that first step is ultimately, right now, likely to get you rejected as being a category on these websites, just flat out, because of the rules that are in place at the moment. Now, maybe I have missed something recently in speedrun.com, but yeah, I haven't figured out how to solve that. You were going to say something as well, and I didn't. Yeah.
No, my point was the same.
Your point was the same? Yeah.
Emulators are interesting because I could see that getting more precise than a console at some point. Imagine something where the emulator is restricted to specific clock rates with tracing of the entire game all the way through. So So you have specific timing, and you know, like, okay, it's sped up by, something happened, it's sped up by 3 megahertz here on the CPU all the way through. I don't know who's going to write that, but.
Okay, so the comment was, in some cases, emulators might possibly be too consistent, effectively?
Well, just from the, we say it's on a console, so it's exactly correct, except for all the places where the consoles have drift and uncontrolled things and a sound crystal that resonates differently from the video processor.
So the topic is consoles themselves that are not consistent with themselves.
So, yeah.
I promised to get back to what you were going to say earlier, but I'm going to talk about this for a few minutes because this matters to me a lot. Okay, we're going to get a little geeky, but that's all right. I'll get past this quickly. The Super Nintendo was released in roughly 1991, has a 21 megahertz main CPU quartz crystal. It's marked as X1 on the motherboard. It also has a completely separate audio processing unit, an APU. The sound chip, in fact, on the original ones, it was a completely different module you could physically take off as a separate daughter board, like a can-looking thing. That audio processing unit has a completely separate ceramic oscillator running nominally at 24.576 megahertz, except it doesn't. And here's where this is interesting. I have seen with my own eyes, I'm phrasing this very cautiously, I have seen with my own eyes the original manuals presented to game developers of the Super Nintendo consoles. So Nintendo created documentation, they provided that documentation to the game developers and said this is how fast things are supposed to run. The game devs had no idea that there were two very interesting properties about these consoles. The first is that on a Super Nintendo with this ceramic oscillator, the sound can change drastically. So much so that consoles today, sometimes you can have two Super Nintendos sitting side by side, and the clock has drifted so much over time, or heat, or temperature, that you can actually hear a pitch difference on the notes because it's drifted either fast or slow. The ceramic oscillators are wildly different based on temperature and how they age. They don't age consistently whatsoever. Why this matters is because there's a main CPU and an audio CPU. And if you're playing a game like Super Metroid, it needs to move the data from the ROM on the cartridge through the CPU to the audio processing unit. And it takes the time as you're moving through a door transition to do that. Only problem is, if it takes a little bit longer or a little bit less, the number of lag frames that you will get as you go through that door transition will change the outcome of what happens to the enemies in that room, which means it's not even consistent for human players. You could precisely memorize timing in a room, but that lag difference might result in a slightly different enemy pattern than you were expecting. An emulator is going to be set at a very specific value and will run at that value. There's one gray area I want to quickly touch on. I mean no disrespect whatsoever to the analog NT. It's an FPGA-based, smaller Super Nintendo. I've got to be very careful what wording I use here. Let's call it a clone. That will probably upset the folks that make it. It is a fantastic piece of hardware, but you cannot get away from the fact that it is an FPGA and it is not the original hardware. And even more complicated, they have a series of PLLs and internal derived timings that are so complex and actually proprietary. We asked the devs if they would share what those were so we could try to get closer to it, and they were unwilling to provide that due to possible competition. So it's a black box to us. It's also a dicey conversation topic. A lot of folks don't really want to touch a hardware clone like that. Anyway, point is, even that still has inconsistency. I know I've done enough tool-assisted speedrun attempts on it, and it's not consistent. So the question then becomes, what if we made the console that accurate? If we made, this is a little messy. Usually the emulator is, of course, by definition, emulating the real hardware. What if we made the original hardware not match the emulator? What if we made the original hardware match the specification handed to the software developers? Like, they were told this was how fast the thing runs, but it doesn't. what if we made it match what they were expecting against, what they were programming against, and made it consistent? And one of the ways we're actively working on this on the TASBot side, if you want to join us and help in these efforts, swing by discord.gg/TASBot. That's the TASBot Discord server. We're actively working on something very bizarre. We are trying to add determinism to real consoles by that X1 clock, that 21 megahertz main CPU. We want to sample that and then override the audio processor APU's 24.576 megahertz clock signal so that the two are derived from the same source. In other words, we use a ratio and derive the audio clock from the main clock so that they are in sync. You won't end up with a spin lock situation where one processor and the other are running at slightly different offset speeds or slower or faster and deadlock and have to wait an entire lag frame, for instance. So we are actively working on making the original hardware behave the way it was supposed to by biasing that audio chip to the right speed. That'd be awesome, but I have a funny feeling if we told someone, hey, we only made this one minor modification, can we still be on your leaderboards? They'd be like, wait, you did what? So it took me 5 minutes to explain it here, and it's so technical that it almost makes no sense. Just know, the original Super Nintendo, even if you are a very skilled, repeatably performing human speedrunner, the console will just screw you over because it's just not, it's not going to be consistent. And it gets way more complicated on, say, the Nintendo 64. I'm not even going to try to explain that situation. Okay, I got way off track. Let's put a pin in that one. I'm going to go back to what you were talking about adaptations. I never actually heard your question, so.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, so you asked if we knew anybody who has different labels and
Yeah.
wants to speedrun. I actually have a friend, she does not have any control of her thumbs, but she wants to speedrun like Pokemon, right? So she uses foot pedals instead to act as what she would press with her thumbs.
Mm-hmm.
And she was actually rejected by SBA for using those foot pedals.
So the story is that someone who used foot pedals due to being unable to move their thumbs fully, they used foot pedals instead as a substitution, and SDA rejected their submission. Is that accurate?
Yep.
This is not the first time I've heard this story. Again, I'm not here to dunk on SDA. I'm here to try to figure out how to solve the problem. Because I want your friend to be able to submit a run like that with dignity, right? I'm not here to shame people. I want to allow people of all abilities to have a place, a definition. Now, granted, it is going to create... Okay. Wikipedia has inclusionists and exclusionists. This is an exclusionist's nightmare because we're talking about a lot of different branches. If you have to come up with some characteristics, okay, what changed with this particular category? In this case, they went from using their thumbs to using foot pedals. Okay, could we define that as using an alternative control mechanism, just baseline? Or do we need to further subdivide it to using an alternative control scheme and has mobility limitations, or some other level to subdefine that to still allow someone to compete? Because if you're familiar with half coordinated is amazing and competes against human runners at competitive levels with one hand. Really, truly impressive. If it happened to be a situation where the adaptation was all I have with my controller change is a bite sensor and where I look on the screen. That's all the more mobility I have because that's about all I can manage. If that's all the more you could do, those two comparisons would not be fair. Yes, half coordinated is only using half the controller and then is using a controller adaptation perhaps, but it wouldn't necessarily be fair to the person that literally can only use an eye sensor. So category creep is going to be a challenge, and I fully acknowledge that, but I still think we should do it. Now, I might be senior staff member on TAS Videos. I do not speak for the rest of staff when I say I would like TAS Videos to be that repository. I do not have buy-in from the rest of staff on that, but I would like that to be the case. I would like us to return to our roots and allow superplay, where you have tools that allow you to do more than you could on your own, and allow those categories to open up, but for exactly that kind of reason. Anyway, that's my take. Okay, what other considerations have folks thought of as we've talked through this? Any ideas that have sprung to your mind by any of the topics we've covered so far?
I think this kind of discussion, sorry, within the community of people who are affected by this question would be great. I think the task community is a really great example of when that grew from obscurity into collective research and collaboration. This community really just grew almost, out of nowhere. I have friends who I've shown task videos, and they immediately have disdain. They don't understand it. And then, I sort of sometimes successfully, sometimes not successfully explain all of the efforts and all of the history behind it. So I think if maybe something could be started like that, like a conference or some type of regular event where people can share their findings, because certainly in terms of modifications and adaptations, there is a science, there is a method behind it, and there are things that work and don't. I think enabling that discussion and really putting it to the forefront will maybe even change the minds of some people who immediately have that reaction.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to try to condense all of that. Effectively, very valid point. We should be having this conversation with people in this community. I've used the phrasing differently abled, for lack of a better term, and by all means, I don't even know if that's the right term yet, so we'll get there. We should absolutely be doing that. I've certainly interviewed a few folks in that community, and there is not agreement. There's not agreement on that. Partly because of how diverse this is. And really, this is a conversation about diversity and accepting that diversity, really. The second thing you mentioned was, maybe I've forgotten how you phrased it. Just describing how task videos has been hard to explain to other people because it's kind of a hard concept. It took me, what's my time even? It took me how long to even describe up to this point? Okay, we're already at 45 minutes in, actually, on this allegedly 45-minute talk. We might run over a little bit. We're 45 minutes in, and we've only just now barely described the topic. So this is not an easy thing to discuss. I do think that it is very worth having more discussions with folks. I have had some fantastic conversations with Able Gamer. Able Gamer is headed in a slightly different trajectory. It's not a bad trajectory, but they're trying to meet slightly different needs. One of the things that I wanted to do a full 2 years ago was allow people who are differently abled to interact with consoles that were actively prohibiting them from touching it. One of the things that I was working on was an idea for R.O.B. That's a computer-human input relay interface, like computer-human input relay bot that just is taking input from, say, the Microsoft, I believe it was called the accessibility controller. I think that was how they phrased it. Adaptive accessibility controller. It was a rectangular device, 2 really large buttons, and it had individual, effectively microphone jacks on the back that could be connected to anything, whether it was a bite sensor, a foot sensor, a blink sensor, whatever. You could adapt anything with it. But it was specifically made for Xbox and, to a limited extent, Windows. Right? That was what it was built for. We were able to build a device that allowed us to adapt that to a Nintendo Switch with low enough latency as to be still very usable. It was, I think, 1 frame, roughly, of 60 FPS latency. But I didn't get enough traction or volunteers helping out with that to really extend it out to its full vision, which my vision is any input to any output, and we provide the mapping change, both for this button maps to this, and also the context of you're using an NES controller to talk to a PS3. Like it doesn't have to necessarily be specifically for people who are differently abled, but it could be, okay, I'm going the other way around. I have a USB connected device that gives me the accessibility needs I have and gives me that access, but the target device is a Nintendo console, an NES, or a Super Nintendo, or a Nintendo 64. So I'd like to build something that has modules so that we can help break down those barriers. That's just one part of the puzzle. Obviously, if you're using something like that, we would need to be able to say, hey, we use tools, right? So, but again, we shouldn't be shaming people for doing that, and we should make that as accessible as we possibly can. Wow, I burned through my time so much faster than I thought I would. I can't believe I've been talking for 45 minutes. I haven't been kicked out yet, but I do respect our volunteers, so I'm sure he'll start waving in about 5 minutes. What other topics out of all of this do people want to talk about in the audience? Anything that you want to bring up or talk through?
I actually have a question for you about the AI part.
Yeah, we didn't even touch on that. I didn't have time.
Yeah, I wanted to hear what you had to say about it.
Okay, there's some really cool stuff going on right now. And it's not the AI you might be thinking of. It's not ChatGPT. It's not large language models. It's the type of AI that was from the Mar.io project, the stuff that's happened with Coder Wilson and Final Fantasy runs. It's just amazing. An artificial intelligence, machine learning, and then virtual intelligence, artificial intelligence eventually, suite that is able to completely finish the game. Now, again, adaptations, it's skipping the cutscenes, just for time. It was shown at RPG Limit Break, and we also did it in our TASBot-driven task-giving event. It's possible. It took a long time, but it is possible for an artificial intelligence to completely beat the game. Is it competitive with a human? No. It's getting closer all the time. Is it, at some points, edging out a human? Yes, there are some parts where it is able to be more precise than a human. It's able to understand what's going on. And the only data it has is what's happening in memory addresses on the screen. Read only, it's not interfering, other than some stability things that they agree on in the community. So that kind of AI could eventually move on to helping through macros or assistive play. We're on our way there. There's not very many examples of it right now. Artificial intelligence is a buzzword, and it gets thrown around a lot, but the reality is we are in the very beginning stages of it. But I do see AI as being a part of tool-assisted speedruns, and not just in the traditional, we're making an emulator run that is supposed to be for speed. In the context of tools to assist a human, and in this context specifically assisting a human that might not have the ability to quickly dodge around an enemy. I gave the example of Breath of the Wild a long time ago. What if we had a macro where a person has enough ability to wander around, but when they get into a battle, they can do the timing right, so they can press a button and do a dodge roll, but they might not be able to hold, lock on the enemy, jump, and hold the button to the side so that they do a side hop and then immediately start attacking. Right? That might be a little bit too complicated or like too rapid fire. What if we had either a pre-canned macro or an artificial intelligence component that assisted them? They're still playing the game. They're still experiencing the story. And this is especially important for me in a casual gameplay. I think Breath of the Wild's story is amazing, and a lot of people cannot experience it. Nintendo has not put any accessibility, especially for the blind community, into their recent games. What could we do with AI in the future that might allow them to experience this story? And ultimately, I almost find that as a much bigger deal than speedrunning. Speedrunning is a competitive sport in one sense, but casually experiencing the joy that is the story of Ocarina of Time, or casually experiencing Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, a story like that. Yes, I'm a Zelda fan. Or for that matter, Final Fantasy VII. These games are wonderful. They have fantastic stories, and it would be amazing if more people had access to them. How can we make that possible and also help the speedrunning community in the process? So that's the question. Okay. Any other topics? Oh, you're back. Oh, yeah, what's up?
Well, you brought up Final Fantasy. Exploring the story in a casual way, and while I cannot speak to the disability aspect in speedrunning, people do have mental disabilities that do prevent them from experiencing the stories in the same way. So I think it'd be really cool if I could have an AI. Like I have ADHD, and sometimes I go through a game and I don't match the story, or it's really hard to understand or follow for me. So if
I get it.
I could ask questions and be like, hey, what's God doing right there? That
Yeah.
would be awesome.
So that was about different kinds of challenges. One that I share in. I have what I describe as ADHLAS. It's attention deficit. Hey, look, a squirrel. ADHD is part of me. It is part of what makes me me, but it is infuriating sometimes when I miss key details. What can we do to maybe provide more accessibility? I love rewind support. I thoroughly enjoyed playing Braid. If you've never played it, it's worth it. It has a rerun feature. I was able to go, hey, wait, what just happened? And back up in time, and I loved it. It would be wonderful if we had more features like that. You actually have some of that even in sanctioned emulators now. Even Nintendo, with the Nintendo Online subscription, allows for save states. I never would have thought they would do that. So that is at least one minor bit of accessibility. But you're not wrong. It's very much the same way. OK, any other comments from anyone else? OK, this was a wild ride. We are not going to solve how to handle accessibility and tools in gaming casually and in speedruns in a 45-hour-long, slightly over, presentation. We're not going to solve it all right now. In fact, just starting the conversation is the first step. I don't have all the answers, and this isn't a perfect talk on the topic by any means. I'm just now digging into the surface of how complex all the layers are. I challenge you, go out, think about what we might be able to do to help. What might be able to come together and do? You are welcome to join the discussion. Head on over to discord.gg/TASBot. I'm part of the TASBot community. You're also welcome to join the TAS Videos Discord server. I believe it is also gg/TAS Videos. I think they finally got that URL. You're more than welcome to ping me on there or wherever. Thank you so much for coming to a completely undefined talk and exploring this topic with me. I really appreciate it. That's all for tonight.